Picture this. You're 6 miles above the Earth, traveling at 400 miles per hour in a machine made of aluminum and fabric. Your oxygen mask fogs with each breath in the -40-degree cold. Through your canopy, you spot them. A formation of enemy fighters, glinting like deadly silverfish in the sun. Your hands grip the control stick. Your thumb hovers over the gun button. In the next 60 seconds, you'll either be an ace or a statistic. Welcome to the reality of World War II dogfighting, where Hollywood spectacle meets brutal physics, and where the difference between life and death often came down to a single, split-second decision. For decades, movies and video games have fed us a steady diet of romantic aerial combat. Graceful planes pirouetting through the sky, pilots exchanging gentlemanly salvos, dramatic explosions, and heroic victories. But the real story of WW2 dogfighting is far more complex, far more terrifying, and infinitely more fascinating than anything Hollywood has shown us. Today, we're going to strip away the mythology and examine exactly how dogfighting really worked during the Second World War. The tactics, the physics, the psychology, and the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare that killed over 100,000 airmen during the conflict. Let's start by destroying the most persistent myth. Most aerial combat in World War II wasn't actually dogfighting at all. When we hear the term dogfight, we imagine swirling, prolonged aerial duels with planes looping, rolling, and chasing each other's tails in extended battles of skill and endurance. The reality: most aerial victories in WW2 came from attacks the victim never saw coming. Studies conducted during and after the war revealed a staggering statistic. Approximately 80% of pilots shot down never knew what hit them. They weren't outmaneuvered in graceful aerial ballet. They were simply murdered from behind, often by an enemy they never spotted. The German ace Adolf Galland said it best: "The fighter pilot who sees the other first already has half the victory." But even this undersells it. Seeing first wasn't half the victory, it was often the entire victory. This wasn't the chivalrous aerial combat of World War I, where pilots supposedly waved at each other before engaging. By WW2, air combat had evolved into something far more calculated and lethal. The most successful fighter pilots weren't necessarily the best stick and rudder men. They were the best hunters. They understood that dogfighting was less about aerobatic skill and more about geometry, energy management, and predatory patience. The most effective tactic in World War II air combat was deceptively simple: dive from above, fire a quick burst, and zoom away before the enemy could react. This boom and zoom approach dominated the thinking of successful fighter pilots on all sides, though each nation's Air Force doctrine embraced it to different degrees. The reason was pure physics. An aircraft diving from altitude converted potential energy into kinetic energy. This meant speed, tremendous speed that gave you every advantage. You controlled the engagement. You chose when to attack, from what angle, and when to disengage. The pilot below you, even if he spotted you, had limited options. He couldn't easily follow you up if you decided to zoom away. His engine would struggle to climb quickly while yours was still carrying momentum from the dive. German Luftwaffe pilots, particularly those who survived the early years of the war, perfected this approach. The legendary Erich Hartmann, the highest scoring ace of all time with 352 confirmed victories, described his method bluntly: "I would wait until I was very close, about 50 meters, identify the aircraft type, wait until the enemy aircraft filled my entire windscreen, then fire a short burst and immediately break away." Notice what's missing from that description. There's no mention of aerobatic maneuvering, no dogfighting, no prolonged engagement. It was stalking, striking, and escaping. American pilots, once they learned the hard lessons of early combat, adopted similar tactics. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang were both excellent boom and zoom platforms. They were fast in a dive, had powerful engines that could build speed quickly, and packed devastating firepower. American doctrine increasingly emphasized the altitude advantage and diving attacks, especially when facing more maneuverable Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. But what happened when boom and zoom wasn't an option? What happened when you couldn't get altitude advantage, or when the enemy spotted you first, or when you were jumped from above? That's when real dogfighting began, and that's when things got truly desperate. When two or more aircraft became entangled in close combat, what pilots call a furball, the engagement became a three-dimensional puzzle of angles, energy, and timing. This is what most people picture when they imagine a dogfight, but the reality was far more complex than Hollywood suggests. First, understand that every aircraft has a specific turn rate and turn radius. These are not the same thing. Turn rate is how quickly you can rotate around a point, measured in degrees per second. Turn radius is how tight a circle you can fly. Both are crucial in a dogfight, but they work against each other in a fundamental way. You can turn tight or you can turn fast, but you can't do both simultaneously at the same speed. The tighter you turn, the more lift your wings must generate, which means more drag, which bleeds your energy. Lose too much energy in a turn, and you approach stall speed, the point where your wings can no longer generate enough lift to keep you airborne. In a combat situation, stalling meant death. You became a slow, helpless target hanging in the air. This created a brutal calculus for pilots in a turning fight. Every maneuver was a trade-off between position and energy. Pull too hard on the stick to get your nose around to an enemy, and you might succeed in pointing at him, but you'd be going so slowly that you couldn't keep him in your sights or avoid his next move. Maintain your speed to preserve options, and the more maneuverable enemy might outturn you and get into a firing position. Different aircraft excelled at different aspects of this equation. The Japanese Zero was legendary for its turning ability. It could outturn almost anything in the sky, especially at lower speeds. But this came at a cost. The Zero achieved this by being lightly built, with minimal armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It also had relatively low wing loading, which meant it turned well but couldn't dive as fast as heavier aircraft. American pilots learned the hard way not to turn fight with Zeros. The official doctrine became, don't dogfight a Zero. Instead, they exploited the Zero's weaknesses. American fighters were heavier, more robust, and faster in a straight line or dive. The winning tactic was to make slashing attacks, dive in, fire, and use superior speed to extend away before the Zero could bring its turning ability to bear. If a Zero latched onto your tail, you didn't try to outturn it. You pushed the throttle forward and ran, using your speed advantage to escape. The Germans faced similar problems with the British Spitfire, which could outturn German Bf 109s and Fw 190s in most situations. Luftwaffe pilots learned to avoid extended turning engagements with Spitfires. Instead, they used vertical maneuvers, climbing and diving, where their aircraft's better energy retention and power-to-weight ratios gave them advantages. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of WW2 dogfighting: the critical importance of the vertical plane. Most people imagine dogfights as horizontal affairs, planes turning in flat circles, trying to get behind each other. But experienced pilots fought in 3 dimensions, and the vertical component was often decisive. When 2 aircraft merge and neither has an advantage, experienced pilots don't pull into a flat turn. They pull up. The vertical fight, using climbs, dives, and barrel rolls to maintain energy while maneuvering for position, was the domain of expert pilots who understood energy management. Here's why the vertical matters. In a flat turn, both aircraft are fighting against the same enemy, gravity's pull, and the need to generate lift. But in a vertical maneuver, you can use gravity as a tool. Climb to reduce your opponent's energy advantage, or force him to burn fuel and speed trying to follow. Dive to convert altitude into speed and energy. Roll inverted at the top of a climb and pull through into a diving attack, using gravity to help accelerate rather than fighting against it. The Germans had a name for this: the high yo-yo. If a German pilot was being outturned by a Spitfire in a horizontal turn, he wouldn't keep pulling harder into the turn and bleeding more energy. Instead, he'd pull up into a climb, roll to keep visual contact with the enemy, then dive back down, using gravity to regain speed while simultaneously repositioning for a better angle of attack. Done correctly, this maneuver converted a losing position into an advantageous one. The low yo-yo worked in reverse. If you were turning inside an enemy but couldn't quite get your nose around to fire, you'd pull down below the plane of the turn, let gravity accelerate you, then pull back up, using the extra speed to tighten your turn radius and pull lead for a shot. These weren't just theoretical maneuvers practiced for fun. They were life-saving techniques born from brutal experience. Pilots who understood energy management and vertical fighting had dramatically higher survival rates than those who fought in the horizontal plane alone. Even if you mastered position and energy management, you still had to solve the hardest problem in air combat: actually hitting your target. Movies show tracers streaming in beautiful straight lines into enemy aircraft. Reality was far more difficult. You weren't shooting at where the enemy aircraft was. You were shooting at where it would be. This is called deflection shooting, and it's phenomenally difficult. Your target is moving at several hundred miles per hour. You're moving at several hundred miles per hour, probably in a different direction. Your bullets are moving at perhaps 2,800 feet per second. Fast, but not instantaneous. By the time your bullets reach where you aimed, the target has moved. Imagine trying to hit a car speeding across a highway by throwing a baseball at it, while you're also in a speeding car, being bounced around, experiencing G-forces that make it hard to move your arms, with your vision tunneling from the strain, and you have about 2 seconds to do it. That's deflection shooting. Most fighters carried guns synchronized to converge at a specific range, typically 250 to 300 yards. Fire closer than this, and your bullets hadn't converged yet. They'd spread out, and most would miss. Fire farther out, and they'd already started diverging again. Plus, gravity and air resistance would have slowed and dropped them. The effective range was shockingly short, about the length of a football field, or less. The best pilots developed an instinctive feel for deflection. They learned to lead their targets by just the right amount, almost unconsciously. But most pilots never developed this skill. Studies showed that only about 5% of pilots accounted for roughly 40% of all kills. These aces weren't necessarily better flyers. They were better shots who knew how to get into positions where deflection shooting was easier. This is why Hartmann's tactics were so effective. By closing to within 50 meters, about 165 feet, he minimized the deflection problem. At that range, even modest shooting skills could be devastating. Of course, getting that close required nerves of steel and perfect timing. Shoot too early from too far, and you'd warn your target and probably miss. Get too close, and you risked collision or flying through the debris of your kill. Let's talk about what it actually felt like to be in a dogfight, because this is where Hollywood really fails us. The physical punishment inflicted on a pilot during aerial combat was extraordinary and often debilitating. First, there's G-force, the acceleration force you feel when maneuvering. In a hard turn, you might pull 4, 5, or even 6 Gs. This means your body weighs 4, 5, or 6 times its normal weight. Your head, normally 10 to 12 pounds, suddenly weighs 50 to 70 pounds. Your arms feel like lead. Blood drains from your brain toward your feet. At 3 Gs, you strain to move. At 4 Gs, your vision begins to narrow. You see through a tunnel. At 5 Gs, that tunnel collapses from the edges, what pilots call grey out. At 6 or 7 Gs, you experience complete blackout. You're still conscious, but you can't see anything. Push beyond that, and you lose consciousness entirely. GLOC, or G-induced loss of consciousness. WW2 pilots didn't have G-suits, which modern pilots wear to help push blood back toward the brain. They developed techniques like the L1 strain maneuver, tensing leg and abdominal muscles while doing a kind of grunt that closes the glottis and raises blood pressure. But this only helped so much. Now, imagine trying to execute complex aerobatic maneuvers, track a moving target, calculate deflection, operate multiple instruments and controls, watch for other enemies, monitor your ammunition and fuel, all while experiencing sustained G-forces that make it hard to move and threaten to make you pass out. Oh, and if you make a mistake, you die. Then there's the cold. At 25,000 feet, the outside temperature is typically minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. Cockpit heating was primitive or non-existent. Pilots wore heavy flight suits and gloves, but their extremities still went numb. Touch metal with bare skin at altitude, and you could lose that skin to frostbite. The physical discomfort extended beyond cold. The oxygen at altitude was thin, requiring supplemental oxygen systems that didn't always work perfectly. Hypoxia, oxygen starvation, could set in subtly, affecting judgment and reaction time, before a pilot even realized anything was wrong. Many pilots died not from enemy fire, but from hypoxia-induced mistakes. And then there was fear, raw, animal terror. Pilots experienced combat stress reactions that included everything from nervous shaking to complete emotional breakdown. Some pilots vomited in their cockpits from fear and G-forces. Others lost control of their bowels. The stress of repeated combat missions created what we now call PTSD, though it wasn't recognized as such at the time. Pilots were simply deemed to have lost their nerve, or were flak happy. Despite all the discussion of tactics and maneuvering, most combat victories were decided in the first 5 seconds of engagement, often before a true dogfight even began. This is worth emphasizing because it reveals the real nature of WW2 air combat. A typical successful attack went like this. A formation of fighters is cruising at altitude. One pilot spots enemy aircraft below, often bombers with fighter escort. He positions his flight to attack from out of the sun, where the enemy's visibility is worst. The formation maintains altitude and speed, waiting for the perfect moment. Then the bounce. The attacking fighters roll inverted and dive, accelerating rapidly. They have perhaps 15 to 30 seconds before the enemy might spot them. Maybe less, maybe more. The leader picks his target and focuses entirely on that single aircraft. The geometry must be perfect. Too steep an angle, and deflection becomes impossible. Too shallow, and you lose speed advantage and become vulnerable to escort fighters. The attacking pilot's thumb hovers over the gun button. Tracers might give away his position, but he needs them to correct his aim, and ammunition is limited. Most fighters carried enough ammunition for only 10 to 20 seconds of sustained fire. Each trigger pull had to count. At 300 yards, he opens fire. 2-second burst. The tracers show his rounds are falling slightly short. He's misjudged the deflection. He corrects, walks the tracers into the target. Strikes. The enemy aircraft might stagger, smoke, or explode, or it might seem undamaged, bullets passing through fabric and aluminum without hitting anything critical. No time to assess. Other enemy fighters are reacting. He breaks off, pulls up and away, uses his speed to escape before the escorts can engage. Total time from start of dive to breaking off, maybe 20 seconds. If the enemy fighter escort was alert and well positioned, the attacker might not even get a shot off before being forced to break away defensively. This is why altitude was everything. The side that controlled altitude controlled the engagement. They decided when to fight and when to run. The side caught low had to react defensively, always at a disadvantage. No pilot survived long fighting alone. By mid-war, all major air forces had adopted some form of mutual support tactics, though they called them different things and implemented them differently. The Germans pioneered what they called the rotor, a two-plane element. The rotor consisted of a leader and a wingman. The leader did the shooting. The wingman protected the leader's tail. Two rotten made a swarm. 4 aircraft in what became known as the Finger 4 formation, because, when viewed from above, the 4 aircraft positioned like the fingertips of a spread hand. This formation was revolutionary because it abandoned the tight, parade-like formations favoured earlier in the war. In a Finger 4, aircraft spread out with space between them. This meant better visibility. Pilots could scan for threats rather than watching their wingtip to maintain formation. It meant better mutual support. Each pilot could easily keep his wingman in sight. And it meant better offensive capability. Multiple aircraft could attack from different angles simultaneously. The British and Americans were slower to adopt these tactics, initially flying in rigid Vic formations of 3 aircraft that left wingmen vulnerable and reduced overall situational awareness. British pilots first encountered the Schwarm, fighting German pilots who had honed their skills in the Spanish Civil War, and they paid dearly for their outdated tactics. Gradually, through bitter experience, Allied air forces adapted and adopted their own versions of the Finger 4. The role of a wingman was perhaps the most dangerous job in fighter aviation. Your primary responsibility wasn't to shoot down enemies, it was to protect your leader. You flew slightly behind and to the side, constantly scanning the sky, particularly the dreaded 6 o'clock position directly behind. While your leader focused on prosecuting an attack, you watched his back. Many wingmen died protecting their leaders, taking bullets meant for someone else, or being so focused on protecting their leader that they missed threats to themselves. Good wingmen were worth their weight in gold, and experienced pilots knew that their survival often depended more on their wingman's vigilance than their own skill. The concept extended beyond just 2 aircraft. In a 4-plane swarm, you had 2 mutually supporting pairs. If one element engaged an enemy, the other element could swoop in from a different angle, creating a crossfire situation that was extremely difficult to escape. The Germans called this freie Jagd, free hunting. Small groups of aircraft working in perfect coordination, using altitude, speed, and position to set up attacks where the enemy had no good options. This required exceptional communication, usually done through hand signals or radio calls, though radio communication in the 1940s was often unreliable, filled with static, and sometimes jammed by the enemy. Visual signals and practice coordination often proved more reliable than radio chatter. The evolution of formation flying also revealed something crucial about aerial warfare. It's not just about individual skill. The most successful fighter units weren't necessarily composed of the best individual pilots. They were units that worked together seamlessly, where pilots trusted each other implicitly, where everyone understood their role, and where mutual support was second nature. A mediocre pilot in a well-coordinated unit would often outperform a skilled pilot operating alone or in a poorly organized formation. This teamwork extended to larger tactical considerations as well. Fighter units didn't just randomly roam the sky looking for enemies. Successful air forces developed sophisticated concepts of operation. Fighters were assigned specific roles. Some flew high cover, positioned thousands of feet above the bombers or ground attack aircraft they were escorting, ready to dive on any attackers. Others flew close escort, staying near the bombers, but at a disadvantage in altitude. The high cover fighters had the better job. They controlled the altitude and could engage on their terms. The close escort had the deadlier job. They often got bounced from above and had to react defensively. Understanding these tactical layers helps explain why certain engagements unfolded the way they did. The fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere in so many accounts weren't lucky. They were positioned correctly, with altitude advantage, and timed their attack perfectly. Now let's talk about something that movies always get wrong: combat awareness and visibility. Spotting enemy aircraft in the vast emptiness of the sky was incredibly difficult, far harder than it appears in films where enemies are conveniently visible against clear, blue backdrops. In reality, aircraft were tiny specks against enormous expanses of sky, cloud, and ground. At combat altitudes, you're looking for something the size of your thumb held at arm's length. And it's moving, possibly camouflaged, potentially hidden in clouds or haze, maybe masked by the glare of the sun. Pilots developed what they called fighter pilot's eye, the ability to detect tiny anomalies in their field of vision, slight movements, glints of reflected light, anything that didn't belong. This skill took months to develop and separated the survivors from the casualties. The Germans had a saying, "Beware of the Hun in the sun." This wasn't just poetic, it was tactical gospel. Attacking from out of the sun was so advantageous that entire missions were planned around solar geometry. The sun's position dictated attack headings, patrol patterns, and tactical decisions. A pilot looking toward the sun saw nothing but blazing light and dancing spots. An attacker coming from that direction was effectively invisible until he opened fire. Experienced pilots became obsessive about checking the sun, craning their necks painfully backward, squinting through goggles, knowing that death most often came from that blinding direction. This constant need for vigilance created incredible physical and mental strain. Imagine spending 3 hours in a cramped cockpit at high altitude, in extreme cold, while constantly swiveling your head, scanning every sector of sky, knowing that a single missed glance could be fatal. Pilots describe the effort as exhausting. Your neck muscles burned, your eyes watered from the strain of focusing at infinity. You developed splitting headaches from the combination of hypoxia, stress, and constant eye strain. Some pilots wore themselves out from vigilance before a shot was ever fired. The physical constraints of the cockpit made this worse. Visibility varied dramatically between aircraft types. Some fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, had bubble canopies that provided excellent all-around visibility. Others, like early model BF-109s, had heavy canopy frames that created blind spots. The worst visibility issue was directly behind, the notorious 6 o'clock position. Most fighters had limited to no rearward visibility. You simply couldn't see what was directly behind you. This is why the wingman's role was so critical, and why mirrors, small, often ineffective mirrors mounted in cockpits, became standard equipment. Even with mirrors, rear visibility was poor. Pilots developed techniques like the weave, where pairs of aircraft would alternate crossing behind each other, each checking the other's 6 o'clock in a continuous pattern. But this burned fuel and wasn't always practical in combat. The sensory overload in combat was overwhelming. You're trying to maintain formation or break formation correctly while watching for enemies, monitoring your instruments, fuel, oil pressure, coolant temperature, ammunition count, managing your throttle and propeller pitch, operating your radio, tracking multiple enemy aircraft, calculating ranges and deflections, dealing with G-forces, fighting off hypoxia, managing your oxygen, and making split-second life-or-death decisions. Oh, and you're doing all this while being shot at. The cognitive load was immense. Pilots described entering combat as entering a kind of focused trance where time seemed to dilate and contract weirdly. Some reported that engagements that actually lasted 30 seconds seemed to stretch for minutes. Others remembered multi-minute battles as brief flashes. The adrenaline, fear, and hypoxia created altered states of consciousness that made accurate recollection difficult. This explains why post-mission debriefings were so important but also so unreliable. Pilots genuinely couldn't always remember exactly what happened. Combat reports are filled with contradictions, 5 pilots in the same engagement reporting wildly different sequences of events. Intelligence officers learn to cross-reference multiple accounts, examine gun camera footage when available, and corroborate with ground observers to establish what actually happened. The confusion of combat meant that many victories were disputed, some losses were unexplained, and the true tally of who shot down whom often remained murky. The famous ACE counts, Hartmann's 352, or others, are based on claims that, while vetted as carefully as possible, undoubtedly contain some errors and misattributions. Let's address the mechanics of actually damaging an enemy aircraft, because this too is more complex than movies suggest. You're not trying to blow up the plane. That's actually relatively rare. You're trying to damage critical systems enough that the aircraft can't continue flying or fighting. Your targets, in order of preference, were the engine, the pilot, the fuel system, or control surfaces. Hitting an engine could cause it to seize, catch fire, or lose power. A wounded engine might struggle on for a while, or quit immediately. Either way, a fighter with a dead engine became a glider, and while skilled pilots could sometimes nurse damaged aircraft home. Loss of power usually meant a forced landing or bailout. Hitting the pilot was instantly decisive, but difficult. The pilot represented a tiny target within the larger aircraft, usually somewhat protected by armor plating, at least in later war fighters. Many aircraft had armored seats and bulletproof windscreens. Still, if bullets found the pilot, the fight was over. Fuel system hits were particularly effective. Puncture a fuel tank, and you had 2 possible results. Either fuel streamed out, slowly starving the engine, or worse, the fuel ignited. Aircraft of the era used high-octane aviation gasoline, basically refined explosive. A fuel fire in the air was almost always fatal. Pilots had seconds to bail out before being consumed by flames, and many didn't make it. The lack of self-sealing fuel tanks in early Japanese aircraft like the Zero made them particularly vulnerable to this fate. One burst in the right place, and the aircraft became a fireball. Control surface damage, hitting wings, tail, or control cables could be just as lethal but worked differently. Lose an aileron, and you can't roll effectively. Lose elevator control, and you can't control pitch. Severe wing damage could cause structural failure, where the entire wing would tear off due to aerodynamic loads. Pilots described seeing enemy aircraft simply disintegrate under fire, wings folding up, tails separating, the fuselage tumbling earthward in pieces. This was the result of either explosive ammunition hitting structure or simply accumulated bullet damage, weakening critical load-bearing components until aerodynamic forces exceeded structural integrity. Different nations favored different armament philosophies, which affected how damage was inflicted. The Germans and British often used combinations of machine guns and cannons. Cannon shells, typically 20 meters or larger, were devastating when they hit, but had limited ammunition capacity and relatively low muzzle velocity, making them harder to aim. Machine guns, typically 7.7mm or 50 caliber, had more ammunition and higher rates of fire, but needed more hits to inflict decisive damage. American fighters typically carried multiple 50 caliber machine guns, 6 in the P-51, 8 in the P-47. The philosophy was that a large volume of heavy machine gun fire was more reliable than trying to score cannon hits. Multiple Ponchtai caliber. Walking through an enemy airframe could destroy systems, cut control cables, shred fuel tanks, and kill pilots quite effectively. The Japanese initially favored lighter armament for weight savings, which allowed better maneuverability, but made their aircraft less lethal. Pilots often reported needing many hits to bring down American aircraft, whose robust construction could absorb significant damage. American pilots conversely found that even brief bursts could destroy the fragile Zeros. This asymmetry in durability significantly affected combat outcomes. American pilots could sometimes survive being hit multiple times, limp home with damaged aircraft, and fly again. Japanese pilots in similar situations often didn't survive the first good burst. Ammunition management was another critical skill that movies ignore. Remember, you only had 10 to 20 seconds of firing time. Fire in long bursts, and you'd run dry almost immediately. Experienced pilots fired in short bursts, 1 or 2 seconds at most, only when they had a good solution. Spraying bullets wildly was the mark of a novice. Aces were misers with ammunition, jealously guarding every round, firing only when geometry and range gave them high probability of hits. Many pilots returned from combat having fired only a few bursts. Others, particularly inexperienced pilots, emptied their guns without scoring a single hit, then found themselves defenseless in the middle of a fight. The psychological dimensions of combat deserve attention because they shaped everything. Combat was intensely personal, yet also strangely detached. You were trying to kill another human being, but at combat speeds and ranges, you rarely saw your enemy as a person. You saw an aircraft, a target, a machine. The pilots who struggled most were those who personalized their opponents, who thought too much about the human they were trying to kill. The successful pilots achieved a kind of emotional detachment where enemy aircraft became targets in a deadly game. This wasn't sociopathy, it was psychological survival. Think too hard about the implications, and you froze. Hesitate, and you died. At the same time, the experience bonded pilots with their squadron mates in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't experienced combat. You trusted these men with your life, literally. Your wingman, your flight leader. These weren't just colleagues. They were brothers in the most profound sense. When one died, it hit hard. Pilots described feeling guilty for surviving when friends didn't, questioning whether they could have done more, replaying scenarios endlessly. The loss rate in fighter units was staggering. Some squadrons lost their entire original roster within months. Survivors often dealt with survivor's guilt, emotional numbness, or desperate attempts to avoid forming new attachments, knowing that those new friends would probably die too. Command recognized these psychological pressures, though they didn't have the vocabulary or understanding we have today. Pilots were rotated out after certain numbers of missions, though the numbers varied wildly by nation and service. American pilots in Europe typically flew 25 to 30 combat missions before being rotated to training or other duties. German pilots on the Eastern Front often flew until they were killed or seriously wounded. There was no rotation system. The psychological toll of knowing there was no end in sight except death was immense. Japanese pilots similarly flew until killed, with the added pressure of a culture that viewed surrender or capture as ultimate dishonor. These factors help explain the eventual superiority of Allied air forces. It wasn't just numbers or technology, it was sustainable doctrine that preserved experienced pilots who could train the next generation. The evolution of tactics over the course of the war tells its own story. Early war tactics were often based on World War I experience or peacetime theorizing, and they were largely wrong. Tight formations, rigid tactics, and an emphasis on aerobatic dogfighting cost unnecessary lives. Combat experience forced rapid evolution. The Germans learned first, having fought in Spain. The British learned Europeans during the Battle of Britain. The Americans learned the hard way in early Pacific battles. By mid-war, all major air forces had converged on similar tactical principles: mutual support, altitude advantage, boom and zoom attacks, energy management, and the importance of seeing first and shooting accurately. Technology evolved in parallel. Early war fighters had maybe 300 horsepower engines. By 1945, fighters were pushing 2,000 horsepower or more. This meant higher speeds, better climb rates, and heavier weights that required longer runways and stronger structures. Armament got heavier. More guns, bigger guns, more ammunition. Radios improved, though they never became truly reliable. Some late-war fighters got primitive radar, allowing night and bad weather interceptions previously impossible. These technological improvements expanded what was tactically possible. A 1940 Hurricane couldn't do what a 1944 P-51 could do. But technology alone didn't determine outcomes. Well-trained pilots in inferior aircraft could and did defeat poorly trained pilots in superior aircraft. Skill, experience, and tactical acumen mattered more than raw performance in most engagements. The broader strategic context shaped dogfighting in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Fighter combat didn't happen in isolation. Fighters escorted bombers, protected ground forces, contested air superiority, and attacked ground targets. The specific mission affected everything. A fighter on bomber escort had different priorities than a fighter on a fighter sweep. Escort fighters had to stay with the bombers, which limited their tactical options. They couldn't always pursue enemies or accept fights on disadvantageous terms because their primary mission was protecting the bombers, not scoring kills. Fighter sweep pilots had more freedom. Their job was explicitly to seek out and destroy enemy fighters. These different missions created different tactical problems and different solutions. The logistics of aerial warfare were staggering. Every flight required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance crew, briefings, debriefings, and coordination with other units. Aircraft required constant maintenance. Engines needed overhaul every few hundred hours. Guns needed cleaning. Radios needed adjusting. One aircraft required dozens of ground crew to keep it flying. The mathematics were brutal. For every pilot in the air, there were 10 to 20 support personnel on the ground. Logistics determined much about who won the air war. The Americans could afford to lose aircraft and replace them quickly. The Germans, as the war dragged on, couldn't. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had capable aircraft but insufficient fuel, insufficient pilots, and insufficient spare parts. They lost the war in the air, not because of inferior tactics or technology, but because they couldn't sustain operations at the necessary scale. The ultimate measure of dogfighting effectiveness wasn't individual ace scores. It was whether you achieved your mission. Did you protect the bombers? Did you prevent enemy bombers from reaching their targets? Did you maintain air superiority over the battlefield? Individual pilots might score multiple kills but fail their mission if the bombers they were supposed to protect got slaughtered. Conversely, a pilot might never score a kill but perform brilliantly by forcing enemy fighters to break off attacks, allowing friendly bombers to complete their runs. This is why the focus on ace scores, while understandable, misses much of the real story. The most important pilots weren't always the highest scoring ones. They were the reliable ones. The ones who brought their wingmen home. The ones who completed missions. The ones who trained new pilots and kept units effective. So, what was WW2 dogfighting really like? It was nothing like the movies. It was brief, brutal engagements where most victims never saw their killer. It was energy management and geometry problems solved while experiencing crushing G-forces. It was the terror of being stalked by an enemy you couldn't see, the frustration of empty guns at the critical moment, the guilt of watching your wingman die. It was flying in formation for hours of mind-numbing boredom, punctuated by seconds of pure chaos. It was coming home with holes in your aircraft, wondering how you're still alive. It was watching friends take off and never return. It was the math problem of whether you'd live long enough to complete your tour. But it was also the ultimate test of skill, courage, and nerve. The pilots who survived weren't just lucky, though luck mattered. They were smart, cautious when appropriate, aggressive when necessary, team players who understood that their survival depended on others, and others' survival depended on them. They studied their enemy, learned from mistakes, and adapted constantly. They mastered their aircraft, understood its strengths and limitations, and flew it at the edge of its performance envelope when necessary. They developed that rare combination of situational awareness, technical skill, and tactical judgment that separated the aces from the statistics. The legacy of WW2 dogfighting shaped everything that came after. The tactics developed in those desperate years, energy management, mutual support, boom and zoom, vertical fighting, remain relevant today, even with jet aircraft and missiles. The lessons about training, doctrine, and sustainability shaped post-war air forces. The recognition that most kills come from unseen attackers drove the development of radar, missile warning systems, and eventually stealth technology. The understanding that pilot skill and training matter more than raw technology influenced how modern air forces structure their training programs. Everything we know about air combat stems from those brutal years when men in aluminum machines fought physics, each other, and their own fear in the deadly sky. The men who fought these battles deserve our respect, not for glorifying war, but for their courage in facing something genuinely terrifying. They climbed into fragile machines, knowing the odds, knowing many wouldn't return, and did it anyway because the alternative was worse. They pushed through fear, exhaustion, and trauma to complete their missions. Some became aces and were celebrated. Most didn't and weren't, but they showed up and did their jobs with the same courage. The true story of WW2 dogfighting isn't about Hollywood heroics. It's about ordinary men doing extraordinary things under conditions we can barely imagine, using tactics more complex than movies ever show, in a form of warfare that was simultaneously more calculating and more chaotic than we usually acknowledge. Understanding how it really worked, the physics, the tactics, the psychological pressures, the brutal calculus of survival, doesn't diminish these men's achievements. If anything, it makes them more impressive. They weren't supermen flying impossible maneuvers. They were highly trained specialists using every advantage of position, energy, and teamwork to win fights where the slightest mistake meant death. They were problem solvers who treated aerial combat as a deadly three-dimensional geometry problem that had to be solved in seconds with incomplete information and your life on the line. That's the real story of WW2 dogfighting, and it's far more fascinating than any Hollywood fantasy. If you found this deep dive into the reality of aerial combat fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that strips away the Hollywood myths and shows you how history really happened. There's so much more to explore about World War II aviation, from the bombers to the ground crews, from the training programs to the development of jet aircraft, and I'll be covering all of it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.